Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Yeah, that's not me. I wish it was. As a pastor, I'm not proud to admit that I really dread that 1 a.m. phone call, the death of a young person, the death of any person before their time. A year and a half ago at Thanksgiving, one of my good friends, we were in school together at Texas A&M, called. It was the Sunday after Thanksgiving, and a couple of students, a sister and brother, were headed back on that Sunday afternoon after Thanksgiving. You could imagine their car loaded down with turkey and all kinds of treats from the mom and dad, and someone hit them from behind and pushed them into the oncoming traffic, and they were both killed, the 19-year-old, the 22-year-old. And the tributes to them. The 22-year-old was in the honors program. She'd received every honor, already had a job lined up, was engaged. The 19-year-old, the same radiant spirit. Their mother was a professor at A&M, so all the faculty had grown up seeing these two brought in and out. Um, I hear something like that, and I got to be honest, with my kids near that same age, I don't know how you go on. Now they went on, they had three other children. I tell myself that's how you go on. Then I think about a really dear friend. He and his wife tried so long to have a baby. I mean, every single thing. And then finally, the little guy adopted from Guatemala. I mean, this kid was like, infectious, gorgeous, little dark hair, somehow 9 or 10, something with his heart. No one had known about it, and he was gone. How do you go on like that? I got to be honest, this idea of walking through the valley of the shadow of death, no, 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 I'm running. I'm running as fast as I can in the other direction. I remind myself of Teddy Roosevelt. I don't know how many of you remember Teddy Roosevelt. He was the 26th president, elected in 1900, and he was larger than life. When I think of Roosevelt, I think of Yellowstone and the national parks, the big game safaris, and the Panama Canal, the Spanish American War, where he led the Rough Riders. But there was also this kind of quiet, tender, sweet side to him. He fell in love with his first wife, Alice. They met at Harvard, and he wrote in his diary, "She was marvelously lovely and beautiful and sweet. There was never a man who loved a woman more. I thought of her every single day, night and day. Even if I was hunting, she was never out of my thoughts. There's no way a man could love a woman more." And 4 years after that entry, she gave birth, Alice was her name, to their first baby, a little girl, Alice Lee. And by this time, Roosevelt was up in New York in the state legislature. He was in Albany, and Alice was with his parents in New York City. And he got the word, the telegram that a little baby had been born, and then the next telegram, "Come home quickly, things aren't well." And when he arrived, his brother met him on the porch to say that their mother, who was only 40, had died earlier that day of typhoid. And later that day, his wife, his beloved Alice, died in his arms. He lost his mother and his wife in the same house on the same day. And in his diary, he put a big X on that day, February 14th, 1884, and he wrote, "The light has gone out of my life. For joy or for sorrow, my life has been lived out." And then he buried his mother and his wife. He christened the baby. He never said his wife's name again. He never said the baby's name. She was just Baby Lee. And he gave the baby to his sister. And he got on a horse and he rode as fast as he could to the Dakotas, to the Badlands. And in his diary, he wrote, "Black care rarely sits behind the rider whose pace is fast enough." In other words, the darkness can't get you if you just keep moving. And he never quit moving. He moved the rest of his life. If you know anything about him, you know he was considered one of the 5 best presidents. He loved being president. He just embraced it. He came back, he remarried, he had 5 more kids. They filled the White House with those kids and their animals. The 3 youngest kids had 14 pets at least. There was a badger and a bear and flying squirrels. And there's the story of Quentin, the little boy on the skates, riding through the Oval Office with snakes on his neck. And Teddy Roosevelt was the biggest kid of all. He loved it. And yet, that pace, that frenetic pace, that recklessness, that brashness, that overconfidence, It had a downside too, and that was his foreign policy, kind of his quickness, his overconfidence in American power. And his sons, 4 sons, wanting to live up to him, all went off and fought in World War I. All were wounded. And the baby, Quentin, 20, an aviator, was shot down and killed. And Roosevelt died 6 months later, the age of 60. And as the historian McCullough said, just from a broken heart, you can't always move fast enough to escape the darkness. In the psalm, we have something so different. There is no running here. Did you hear it? There is this walking in the valley of the shadow of death. And there is no wanting, nothing that you want. There is a complete confidence. And Ellen Davis, the Hebrew Bible scholar, said, while the other psalmists seem to feel free to express their anxiety, this psalmist is completely free from anxiety. There's just no fear at all, because the confidence is in this God who is not just the shepherd, but is also the sovereign, the queen, the king. Did you hear it? Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. In Hebrew, the word for the shepherd's staff and the king's scepter were the same thing. So as Davis points out, what you have here is this God who protects us and provides for us, this sovereign shepherd, right? This powerful one. And that's what she says we're called to as Christians, to embrace what she calls fortitude, Christian toughness, not the toughness that storms the Capitol, but the toughness of the 17-year-old, right? With the camera recording the death of George Floyd. And she says we can live in the face of death with this kind of confidence and assurance because what? God prepares a table for me in the presence of my enemies. And God anoints my head with oil and gives me a cup that overflows. And this table in the midst of my enemies, it's my panic and my fear and my anxiety and my quickness to catastrophize. Maybe for others, it's inadequacy, it's guilt from the past. And of course, it's the enemies out there, those who wish us harm, those who would hurt us, those who would judge us, the wicked dictator, the one stirring up people, the white supremacist. This God stands with us in the face of that. And even more, it gets better. This God wants something from us. This God needs us. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And the Lord teaches us in the paths of righteousness' sake for what? For God's name. It's as if God needs me and you to create a world of more justice and healing and peace because it builds God up. God needs us to care for the planet because somehow God is indebted to that. God, and it's not just a one-time me and you show up, do the right thing, right? With this strength, with this power. No, it's all the days of my life. And the word isn't goodness and mercy shall follow me. It's the Hebrew is stronger. It's pursue. God chases us. God chases us with justice. And God expects us to chase the rest of the world with that justice too. If there was ever a person that I have known of who lived as this sovereign shepherd, who embraced this kind of Christian toughness, who held that together, it was John Thompson, the coach of Georgetown. When Thompson came to Georgetown in 1972, they had no program. We've all grown up thinking of Georgetown as this big powerhouse. They were 3-23. They had been to the NCAA tournament one time in their history in 1943. And in his 27 years there, he took them to the tournament 20 times. They went to the Final Four 3 times. They were national champions in 84 and 85. They lost by a bucket to Villanova. But it was so much more than that. It was the way he lived. He was like the original Colin Kaepernick. He was the original guy, like taking a knee and speaking up and speaking out about racial justice. He famously walked off the court, refused to coach in '89 when the NCAA passed a resolution that would bar athletes who had low scores on entrance exams from receiving scholarships. It would like 95% of the athletes impacted would be black. And he stood firm against that, and the NCAA backed down. And it wasn't that he didn't care about academics. Nobody cared about academics like he. He had been a guidance counselor and a teacher. He never planned to be a coach. The number of his players who graduated was 97%. The players who played for him for 4 years, 76 out of 78 grad. That's like, I mean, that would make a college administrator weep to have those kind of standards, right? And there's a famous story about his player from the Congo, Dikembe Mutombo. He had come over here, he had skipped practice to go to the doctor and have a tooth pulled. And when he got back to his locker for the practice, the coach had a one-way ticket to the Congo and a cab waiting outside. He said, "You did not come here to, play basketball. You came here to get an education." And the player begged and cried, and he let him stay. He was like that. He was absolutely dedicated to providing and protecting his players. Players who, like he, had grown up in really often desperate situations, like Allen Iverson. Some of you know this story. Iverson was the #1 recruit in '93 in football and basketball in the United States. Until February 14th, he was involved in a bowling alley brawl in Hampton, Virginia. It became a black and white fight, brawl. 3 or 4 people had minor injuries. There were no knives or weapons. None of the white people were charged. Iverson was charged and convicted and given, a 17-year-old, given 15 years in prison. It was reduced to 10 years, and then thank God the governor of Virginia commuted it at 4 months because there was no evidence that he was even in the bowling alley when the brawl took place. But it was done. His career was over. He had grown up in a family so poor. His mother was 15 when he was born. They didn't have food to eat. I mean, I'm not saying like, oh, now they didn't have food. They didn't have medical care. His mother drove up to Georgetown. Someone took her, and she went into Coach Thompson. Not one coach in the country would take a risk on this young man. And she begged him. She pleaded with him to take her son. She said, "He'll be dead. He'll be dead if you don't." And Thompson didn't even know what a good player he was, really. But the mother pleading, he took him. And of course, Iverson went on to be one of the best college players ever, one of the best NBA players. And when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, he started by thanking God, and then he thanked Coach Thompson for saving his life. And that was not an exaggeration. And that was over and over again. Thompson was known for the way he could cuss and for being a tough guy and for being imposing. And there was that story about the time he called the drug dealer from D.C. into his office, Rayful Edmond III. He was a notorious drug dealer. He's now in federal prison where he'll be the rest of his life, kind of implicated in like 30 murders. But he loved Georgetown. He loved the Hoyas, and he loved the Georgetown players. And when Thompson found out that some of his players were hanging out with them, he called the drug dealer to his office. So the first remarkable thing was that the drug dealer came. And as sports reporters have covered that through the years, he stood over him and he unleashed the F word, and he told him, "You stay away from my players. Don't you get anywhere near him," and sent him out. And remarkably, Thompson lived, right? There was no retaliation. But then when he printed his autobiography, when it came out this year, just a few months after Thompson died, the story is really more remarkable than that. He called Rayful Edmond into his office, another kid who'd grown up in really tough situations, not enough to eat, become a notorious drug dealer. He didn't scream and yell at him. He talked to him. He explained to him why his players couldn't have anything to do with them. And then he listened to him. And he heard this young man talk about how he wished he could have gone to college. He would have loved to play ball too. The world is just not that black and white, is it? The world is messy. We're called in it all to be kind of tough, to be soft, to be generous. Even Thompson needed that himself. When he came into the NCAA, one of the very first black coaches, you think the white coaches were eager to embrace him in the early 70s? Man, a lot of these teams didn't even have black players on them. But Dean Smith, North Carolina, Dean Smith, who is himself his own civil rights advocate, He called John Thompson and he showed him the ropes. He kind of gave him the inside scoop, how it was really done. And the two men became very close friends. Thompson Smith's wife later said she learned when the phone rang at 1 a.m. not to be afraid, that it was usually John Thompson calling. And the two men would talk for hours. It wasn't just that. Thompson had the support and the care always of his parents. His father's people had been slaves. His father couldn't write his own name, never learned to drive, too poor for his parents to come to his games. Thompson said when he saw the video of George Floyd and he heard him calling out for his mama, he identified because the safest place he ever felt was in his mama's arms, which is why he always wore that kitchen towel over his shoulder. People see that, his trademark, and they think, oh, it's just a towel to wipe the sweat. No, that was in memory of his mother, a tribute to her. She was a teacher, but because of the discrimination in the nation's capital, she never taught. She cleaned people's homes. His parents adored him. They didn't have enough to eat. They waited until the kids ate before they ate. They came to only one of his games. They were only able to travel to Providence, never to see him play, only to see him graduate. But he wore that towel over his shoulder to remind himself of his mother, who was always wiping her hands, drying a dish. And this fall, some of you may have seen it, through the basketball season, the way the world was sort of broken open, right? And the way coaches who'd never had a voice somehow now had the Black Lives Matter patch on, right? With say your name back across the players' backs. Those players, those coaches wearing the towel to honor Thompson, trying to say, we can all be more the sovereign shepherd. We can all find our voice. We can all speak up. I've spent way too much of my life afraid of the 1 a.m. phone call, panicked and worried and thinking, what if? I've spent too much of my time worrying about what somebody might think about me. And I don't know about you, but this year has broken that open for me. I am just ready to go in a fresh, new direction. I'm going to put the kitchen towel over my shoulder whenever I'm feeling afraid. And I'm going to remind myself that like Thompson, like so many others, like those, trying to find their way out of a life of drugs, I can live with more Christian toughness, knowing for sure that wherever we go, surely God will follow us all the days of our life. Amen.